So my name is Gene Moreno. I'm the director of the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center. If you're new to the Art and Research Center, we're the research department of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Miami. We run symposia and seminars throughout the year. And from those, we draw different teaching tools in the form of podcasts and other digital artifacts. And hopefully next year, we're going to start our ebooks. At the Art and Research Center, we run 3 lines of inquiry. The first has to do with climate and cultural production, being based our brick and mortar in Miami. We kind of think climate and cultural production are quite significant topics for us. And that's a great program. We usually focus on that in the summer through our summer intensive program, which is a 2-week kind of think tanky structure in which we invite folks from different fields, from indigenous perspectives, from post-capitalist perspectives, to kind of think of what the world should look like in what some call the Anthropocene, and what cultural production can do in those conditions. The second line, of which tonight's lecture is a part, is on climate and cultural production. It's on computation and social relations. So just thinking, what does it mean to live in a planet that's fully digitized and capitalized at this point as well? And the third line is critical thinking of the global African diaspora, which we do with the folks at the Africana Studies program at the University of Miami. And that, I think that's self-explanatory. And I think what's exciting about tonight's lecture with Jonathan Beller is that he kind of straddles 2 of these fields. You know, he thinks quite a lot about the afterlives of slavery and colonialism in a planet that's digitized. And I think he attends to these things not only as important in themselves, but also as things that have been lacking in media studies and tech studies. So I think it's where we need to go, right? We need to kind of figure out how it is that real world effects impinge and produce the kind of digital planet we have and not another one. So that being said, Jonathan Beller is professor of Humanities and Media Studies and co-founder of the graduate program in Media Studies at Pratt Institute. His books include The Cinematic Mode of Production, Attention Economy and the Society of the Spectacle from 2006, Acquiring Eyes, Philippine Visuality, Nationalist Struggle and the World Media System from 2006 as well. The Message is Murder, Substrates of Computational Capital from 2017. And for forthcoming, The World Computer, Derivative Conditions of Racial Capitalism. He's a member of the Social Text Editorial Collective, and his lecture tonight is titled Provocatively in the Form of a Question, From World Computer to Post-Capitalist Economic Media. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Gene. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate the invitation to the ICA and all of your work in bringing this together, and Moises as well, and as well as all the students who have been in the seminars the last couple of days. This is, I'm just going to say right now that I'm talking to a computer, and I know there are people sort of, on the other side of this digitization process. However, if at any point I drop out or you can't hear me, someone should let me know so that I don't give a 2-hour lecture by myself in this room. It's not going to be 2 hours. I think what I'll do is I'll talk for about 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then we can have Q&A in whatever form the protocol allows. I'm not sure if that's written questions, which I'm supposed to read and then comment on, or if we can have some genuine conversation back and forth. Excuse me, but we'll find out. The last couple of days, it's been really my pleasure to be in seminar with the group gathered at ICA. We've been discussing the notion of computational racial capitalism, something which is kind of polemically put together in the introduction to my book, because it's an attempt to demand that we think about these 3 things which are often considered separately and disciplinarily: computation, racism, racialization, and capitalism all at once. And it's kind of difficult to think those 3 things together. But even as Gene said, in introducing me, I I work in the wake of the Middle Passage into slavery, and I think we all live there consciously or not. And this process of enslavement, which underpins so much of the history of capitalism, I also see as a precursor to digitization. They're not separate phenomenon ultimately. I think it's a challenge to be able to think these things together, sort of, and begin to track the relations of enumeration, numeracy, quantification, and calculation, which is endemic to social relations, historically speaking. But that's something we did in the last couple of days. We spent some time on what I call the social difference engine. We thought, about the way in which race and racialization was technically produced, and how numbers and language discourse was inscribed not only in culture, but on people's bodies very directly. So there was a conversation about epidermalization there, which is the inscription of race on bodies, and the recognition that those means were also part of a long history of violence, and highly variable and ongoing. We also looked a little bit at gender and the way in which not only is the domestic space a result of industrial capitalism, modern domestic space, but the category of woman, at least according to Silvia Federici, is the result of a social organization organized in order to extract worker from an emerging extract value from an emerging proletariat. I mean, the point is that these forms of social difference are not naturally occurring, have very complex histories, which are really inseparable from the development of capitalism, which goes through the industrial age into computation. So the ability to calculate based upon the ostensible value of people who are socially marked becomes a central feature in the emergence of not only global society, but a global society that runs on computation and then uses these forms of difference in order to expand itself and perpetuate itself. The next day, we spent some time thinking about commodification and saw the commodity, which is the object that has both a use value and an exchange value, at least in its most simple definition, as being the seed of the emergence of the ability to assign number to any quality, whatever. And so we spent a little time thinking about the way in which the money economy, the money emerges as the money commodity first, one commodity among many, but then becomes the commodity which can be divided and quantified and becomes the measure of all other commodities, such that production in general becomes production for commodities. So effectively, not only does gold come out of the mine as seemingly the measure of everything one could do or make, right, of all human possible creativity, but creativity itself, human capacity to produce, is increasingly posited and imagined as exchange value. This obviously changes the ontology of the situation of producers, creators, tremendously, and also the act of creativity itself, and introduces what Marx and others think of as alienation or estrangement, where your power is no longer immediate to you, but it's only your creative power becomes a means to something else, and it has to be exchanged for the social product. But this relationship of alienation is also a relationship of calculation, right, and of numeracy again. And the calculation, as we looked at when we read Hayek, becomes a kind of computation where the money system becomes able to basically compute substitutable choices in order that the people in the network of money can optimize their decision making, but also not know too much about the consequences of their decisions. So from a financial point of view, optimization seems pretty positive, right? But from a social and historical and cultural point of view, from the point of view of social justice or social transformation, what you have with the money system is the erasure of all the conditions that allow it to work. right? So you have a system of accounts that only accounts for exchange value, but can't account at all for use value. So exchange value, like computation and information, becomes content indifferent. These moments of racial abstraction, monetary abstraction, are forms of real abstraction. They come about as a result of the exchange that people do. So it's what people do that that creates the abstraction. They're abstract in deed, in practice, and then the forms in which those abstractions are grasped and utilized follow suit. So money comes after exchange, right? Not before, at least logically. So that was kind of the seminar, a brief summary of the seminar, which I wanted to give those who were just kind of present for the first time in this, what I think of as a series. I'm going to try to share my screen for a second and just say a few more kind of introductory things. Let me see if I can do this. I know I can, but can you? Okay, let's see if this works. Maybe. All right, so hopefully you can see that. I have no idea if you can, but this is the title of my talk tonight, from the world computer to post-capitalist economic media, and the book that's coming out right now is called The World Computer: Derivative Conditions of Racial Capitalism, and actually the next thing I'm working on is going to be called something along the lines of post-capitalist economic media. I just wanted to situate it in the context of the books that Gene already mentioned. I mean, I think of them kind of as a series. They weren't planned as a series, and certainly my current thinking I couldn't have accomplished when I was writing the early stuff. But I put the titles up there for you to see because they do sort of track stages in the transformation of the role of screen capture of productive value from cinema to computation, and with the ubiquitous screen and ubiquitous computing. But in the cinematic mode of production, I guess maybe the main insight there, which I would want people to know about, is the notion of attention economy and the fact that the screen enters into social space and becomes a new form of value capture, where people used to go into the factory and work in a way that was alienated and receive currency or wage in return. We began to work in screens, kind of unbeknownst to us, where we receive social currency, social know-how in return for our attention, which could then be monetized, right, and produced value. Acquiring eyes was really a way of thinking about this from the bottom up, rather than sort of like, I guess, the top down and of the dialectic, where I, having lived in the Philippines and taught in the Philippines for many years, I had a chance to know a lot about Philippine radical culture, revolutionary culture, and Philippine cinema and painting, and began to recognize that there were certain actions in the visual space which were direct efforts at decolonization and imperialist culture making. And that in a way, the visual was still a relatively autonomous zone, even though the state and narratives about the state had been captured by the imperialist US and a kind of hegemonic form. So all discursively, the revolution was defeated at some level. Visually, it flourished in many different ways. And so it was really interesting to see the way in which these visual projects were challenging some of the logics of visual accumulation, which came about in cinema. And you could really see that in this cultural space. There was the persistence of a revolutionary imagination and revolutionary struggle. And one could even say, I would say now, revolutionary value creation, right? Sort of the attempt to create persistent values which should not fall into capitalism, which were not monetizable, but really meant something else and projected a different future. The message murder is there to remind us, and to remind myself actually, that currently in the current communications infrastructure, which is something that can't but help validate fixed capital and therefore capital investment, no matter what we say, has murder as one of its consequences. I mean, in a global situation in which 2 billion people live on $2 a day, and the number of people whose future is canceled is greater than the population of planet Earth in 1929. Validating the system means murder, means genocide, means forced migration, means the build of the military-industrial complex, means all of these things which help to sustain capital and a part of its calculus, actually. So there's a kind of checkmating going on about what we can say, what we can do culturally, which I feel is needs to be urgently addressed by cultural workers. And so this is kind of my answer to McLuhan also, who famously said the medium is the message. But if the message is murder, what does that mean about the media, right? So we have to actually go into the protocolization process of media, the way in which it takes semiotic process and monetizes it and try to ask very good questions and possibly redesign it. So I'll be talking about some of that today. I'll be reading a little bit from The World Computer, the book Derivative Conditions of Racial Capitalism, and towards the end of my talk, alluding to some of the ideas in the book, which I think is going to come after, which will be called Economic Media for the Decolonization of Money. So that's sort of the series, and it surprises me, at least, that after really several decades of saying the most negative things I possibly could about society, capital, and media, because in an effort to kind of register the enormity of the violence which was endemic to the global social, I finally have something a little bit more positive to say, which surprises me and is somewhat uncharacteristic, because I guess I reached a certain point in my career and more importantly in my life, where I thought that if I couldn't put something like positive out there, which actually offered some kind of hope, then what was I doing anymore? I mean, there's so many laments, culturally speaking, and there is so much to lament. But at the same time, I saw a window which was quite risky for me to enter into, I think, because it entailed the possibility of compromise or even betrayal. But I felt like it was worth seeing if this window was promising in any way. So to go into to think more about finance and money and monetization, and recognize that political economy, which had been taken off the table in postmodernism, sort of capitalism was just a given and the horizon of possibility, to sort of think suddenly about the possibility of redesigning monetary media, and also thinking about money as a medium, in the strong sense, was something a challenge that I became very interested in taking up, and I'm working on that now. So let me try to figure out how to release this screen. Okay, presumably you can see me again. I'm going to read a little bit now from The World Computer, because I want to just share some of that. And then after maybe 10, 15 minutes of that endeavor, I'll switch over and talk a little bit about economic media. So this is from the introduction. The slow nuclear bomb that is the COVID-19 pandemic is but a case in point in the terrible unfolding of what one may hope is still prehistory, manifest as racial capitalism. It is a consequence of the convergence of the global demos being relegated to noise, to the poor image in Hito Steyerl's terms, to volatility by the global computes. And you remember that the poor image is the copied and pasted and retransmitted image, the image that starts to degrade and becomes, because of whatever use, but people are interested in it for whatever reason, we don't know, but they pass it around. It's passed around so many times that it becomes the opposite of, cinema, right? It becomes the opposite of museum quality images. It's just the shit image that people use. And stereo really interestingly locates in that noise the presence of a community, right? The presence of a collectivity, right? And it's a very interesting reading of noise. And I've learned a lot by thinking about that. So the virus, COVID-19, is not just information on a strand of genetic material, and should not, as Ed Cohen warned us years ago, be treated fetishistically as if it were the cause of global suffering, right? I mean, if you think about the virus as the cause of global suffering, it really is fetishism. It's kind of a platform fetishism of viruses, and not a recognition that whatever COVID-19 is right now, it's also a very complex set of social relationships. One has to sort of embed the reality of that virus in history. Viruses are everywhere. The global pandemic is symptomatic of world systemic failure on many fronts: healthcare provisioning and access, economic inequality, agribusiness, social hierarchy, racism, etc. Individual bodies are made precarious by a matrix of financialized information that differentiates among us, while externalizing whatever might be left of our pre-existing conditions that could all too briefly be summed up as our real interests, or even our ecological concerns, our connection to the bios in the broadest sense. We are subjected to and by a continuous for-profit reformatting by the various systems of mediation that overcode us as problems to be solved, including by the regimes of all the estates, the fourth estate that is the press, and particularly a fifth estate that has in fact absorbed all the others for its own calculus, namely computation. We observe that the reigning global calculus of profit, though invented by no one in particular, everywhere seeks to extract our value and mostly benefits those who believe in theory or in practice that they are shining examples of a superior race. Those who have almost unlimited access to the social product and to us, to our information, to our time. How does this sense of superiority, of the greatness of our oppressors come about? From their harvesting of the outputs of the rabble and their willing accession to the violence necessary to keep us down. Most recently, the global compute has involved offloading systemic precarity onto individuals, and where possible, onto entire peoples, to the point just reached in 2020, when that strategy itself created radical systemic instability, causing deaths that will likely be in the millions, and not incidentally threatening global depression. Well, one person's or one people's Armageddon is another's depression or their joy. The algorithmic optimization of society for profit, an economics that, while sometimes unconscious, is these days never too far from the conscious mind of the creators of specific programs, collectively affects a wholesale compression of the socioeconomic into what Friedrich von Hayek precisely called a system of telecommunications, capacitated by what he grasped as effectively the price signal. Money, or what in a different key Alfred von Rethel perceived as exhibit A of real abstraction, relegates wherever possible everything else to noise, all of its externalities, right? All of the things that it doesn't and cannot account for, but depends upon in order to run its accounts. The noise, of course, is a source of volatility. The suppression of noise is, from the standpoint of communication theory, a technical matter. Here we understand it is a matter of politics and economy. Noise suppression directly correlates to people's oppression. In financial terms, volatility is a similar index, the expression in prices of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Ironic, then, that volatility has become a major source of value creation for synthetic finance and now for states. The US corona's bailouts of over $3 trillion responses to the volatility of the social, rendered ever more precarious by the existing economy, represent more than 60% of the money ever issued in the history of the country. So you can see how this volatility makes money, for some people, literally leads to the minting of money, which then reinforces the power of the wealthy over the disenfranchised and the dispossessed. What perhaps best characterized this period is a full-blown convergence of communication, information, and financialization. The communication, information, and financialization as computation. Whether or not this convergence and all its incipient violence can be redesigned is an open question. This question is ultimately about a possible politics of the protocolization of these informatic networks within a literally universal system of computation that, as hypostatic states, looks like a virtual machine, what I here call the world computer, and as diachronic flow or processing is nothing less than economic media. Can these formations that for their proprietors profitably collapse message and value be hacked or reprogrammed so that the command control centers that make the most from difference are not in the hands of racist plutocrats, do not in fact produce them? That question, though addressed in this volume, will be taken up more fully at a later date. Here in this book, we consider the various social vectors and components function, and then reactivated dire co-articulation of racial capitalism and computation, rearticulated as computational racial capitalism and its virtual machine, the world computer. So this is a section called Information as Real Abstraction, which I'll read a little bit more from. Taking the notion that capital is always a computer as a starting point, the world computer understands the history of the commodification of life as a process of encrypting the world's myriad qualities as quantities. Formal and informal techniques, from double entry bookkeeping and racialization to the rise of information and discrete state machines, imposed and extended the tyranny of racial capital's relentless calculus of profit. By means of the violent colonization of almost all social spaces, categories, and representations, where today language, image, music, and communication all depend upon a computational substrate that is an outgrowth of fixed capital. All or nearly all expressivity has been captured in the dialectic of massive capital accumulation on the one side and radical dispossession on the other. Currently, the money likeness of expression, visible as likes and in other attention metrics that treat attention and affect as currency, is symptomatic of the financialization of daily life. And that term's from Randy Martin. All expression, no matter what its valence, is conscripted by algorithms of profit that intensify inequality by being put in the service of racial capitalism. Consequently, we are experiencing a near apocalyptic world-scale failure to be able to address global crises, including migration for reparations, carceral systems, genocide, militarism, climate racism, pandemic, anti-Blackness, extinction, and other geopolitical ills. The colonization of semiotics, and I think that's a key feature here, the colonization of semiotics by racial capital has rendered all democratic modes of governance outmoded, save those designed for the violent purpose of extracting profits for the enfranchised. Culturally, these modes of extraction take the form of fractal fascism. An understanding that informationalized semiotic practices function as financial derivatives may allow for a reimagining of the relationship between language, visuality, and that other economic medium, namely money, in an attempt to reprogram money and therefore the creation and distribution of value, and thus also the politics and potentials of representation. In what would amount to an end of postmodernism, understood as the cultural logic of late capitalism, our revolutionary politics require, as did the communisms of the early 20th century, a new type of economic program. In the age of computation, putting political economy back on the table implies a reprogramming of our cultural logics as economic media for the radical redress of the ills of exploitation and the democratization of the distribution of the world social product. Sustainable communism requires the decolonization of abstraction and the remaking of the protocols of social practice that give rise to real abstraction. So it's not just the abstractions, it's the things that people do in order to create the abstractions that need to be transformed. Though in this section, we will more narrowly address the issues of money, race, and information as real abstraction and their role in computational racial capitalism, we note the overarching argument for the larger study. And I'll just share these points with you. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Yeah, so these are the points, some of the points from the larger study. Commodification inaugurates a global transformation of qualities into qualities and gives rise to the world computer. And that's a fairly simple statement, but what I'm trying to add is that the onset of world capitalism was digital culture already. I think of it as digital culture 1.0. And the rise of the discrete state machine becomes the intensification of digitization at the point where information becomes a new way of organizing society. What the text argues, which I think is somewhat controversial and maybe not perfectly proven, but still of interest, is that information itself is not an ontological form, but arises in the footprint of the value form. So the process of quantification of qualities is proto-informatic, and information becomes the extension of those capacities. Oops. So information is not a naturally occurring reality, but emerges in the footprint of price and is always a means to posit the price of a possible or actual product. And you might want to sort of hold that in your mind and do a thought experiment and try to think of exceptions as a way of challenging, but maybe also verifying the hypothesis. I mean, when is information not used to wager something on the possibility of value capture? I mean, this is just kind of hard to do in a non-dialogical domain, but the notion is that information, that the market as computation is already information processing, and that information becomes a way of extending and nuancing risk, because there's always a cost price of information and a cost to collect information. So this becomes effectively a derivative structure on an underlier. So with that, in the book, I rewrite the general formula for capital, MCM prime, which is Marx's formula, where M is money and C is commodity and M is more money. I rewrite that as MIM prime, where I is information. And if you remember in the classical account, the money has to pass through commodity to become more money. And simple circulation is an equal exchange, right? The amount of labor time and money is exchanged for the amount of labor time in the commodity, and that's an equal exchange. But where you get surplus money, where you increase your money, is in the production of the commodity, right? In the extraction of surplus value, at least for Marx, in which the wage becomes a means of abstraction, value abstraction, and also extraction. Right? The worker's time, their life, their subjectivity is converted into a number denominated in money, but what they're getting paid is actually less value than when they're producing for the capitalist, which is why you get accumulation on one side and dispossession on the other. That's the classical formula. But what I'm suggesting is that information is actually the development of the capacities of the commodity, and it's what networks production and consumption in much more complex ways. And in the paper that was assigned for tonight, for anybody who had a chance to read it, or it's available if you haven't, I have a notion of informatic labor, which is a development from my theory of the productive value of human attention, in which what we do when we produce information is we turn basically crunch the numbers in the discrete state machines by providing input. And that number crunching is directly linked to monetization in the derivative mode that I mentioned earlier. So our production of information and communication and semiotics, but all the way down to our metabolic processes and geolocation and other kinds of data scraping is captured by computation itself in order to create value. So we're at the level of metabolism or lifetime, we are now working in the way we used to work in factories, plantations. And I guess one more thing to say about that, although, like I said, it's very hard enough to develop this just sort of out of thin air and not in dialogue, is that the process of alienation from labor is also carried over. the kind of reification of mind, the reification of the object, and the fact that even as we are producing information, and even though we're getting something in return for that information, dissymmetrically, we are alienated from the product. It's really not in our control. We can't allow our own values to persist in the value creation that we embark on. In fact, our values are collected and stripped and turned into currency, right? They're turned into money for shareholders. So that means that there's been a worldwide transformation of labor. Labor, attention, cognition, metabolism, life converges informatic labor, whose purpose with respect to capital is to create state changes in the universal Turing machine that is the world computer. Racial capital's relentless, granular, and planetary computation of its accounts. And I also should say that actually it's risk management, right? Because it's possible to write options on people's futures. You can take on a small cost, people can offload their risks, and you can bet on a variety of outcomes, more than one. The colonization of the socio-semiotic and their derivative condition. Semiotics, representation, and categories of social difference function as financial derivatives, as wager on the economic value of their underliers, and as means of structuring risk for capital. So that's true of a Facebook build out or Google innovation, but it's also true for those of us who have to wager. I used to call it wagering within the image, but wagering within information, where we have to venture something in the informatic space in order to get a return on the social ourselves. It's an extension of Foucault's notion of the entrepreneur of the self, right? Where one manages one's own capital in order to get an income stream. This income stream now is like, it's a job in the old sense, possibly, but it's also our networks, it's our friend groups, it's the number of hits we get when we do one thing or another. It's all the different ways in which value capture is takes place on computation, and we try to get a return from that. And that is becoming an increasingly general situation. And in fact, you could look at other kinds of more traditional forms of servitude or work and see that they don't escape this, even though they might not be directly engaged with a screen. Because screens and the command control power of screens affect absolutely everyone, no matter where you are in the food chain of production, to the point where farmers in India, there's a dissertation that argues this, that farmers in India actually become portfolio managers who have to hedge the risk by doing one thing or another and being able to respond to variations in the world market. And so they don't escape this situation of their crop becoming a derivative, right? It's a particular instrument for risk management. And I guess I should add here, my understanding of what the derivative is and how it works actually changed my understanding of what the commodity is too, which is also a risk management tool, right? That rather than just having a single exchange value, the commodity has a spread of exchange values. And whether you hold it or sell it now, later, whatever it is, these are constantly, these are ways of, these are situations of volatility and risk, which holding on to the commodity is a strategy for managing. Getting there. So only a direct engagement with the computational colonization of the life world through a reprogramming and remaking of the material process of abstraction that constitute real abstraction can secure victory in the form of a definitive step out of and away from racial capitalism for the progressive movements of our times. Now I realize that's a large claim, and maybe one that people would want to argue with. Such a definitive movement requires an occupation and decolonization of information, and therefore of computation, and therefore of money. Only through a remaking of social relations at the molecular level of their calculus, informed by struggle against oppression, can the beauty of living and the fugitive legacies of creativity, community, and care prevail. So I've gone on for, I guess, about 40, 45 minutes now. I think I'll just say would economic media, maybe, and then we can open up a conversation if that's possible. But I think one of the things that I want to try to make as clear as I can is that economic media already exists. You know, we're already in a situation in which the forms of media that we think of as being separated, for example, monetary media, right, and financial instruments, and communications media, are actually working on a continuum and beginning to share many, many features with one another. You know, people who use Venmo recognize that there's a social media dimension to that, right? But more than that, the banking system, its institutions, the credit scoring system, these mediate relationships among people, and they use social indices in order to evaluate people's risks and make loans. So they're functioning as a way not only of measuring financial risk, but it's directly translated to forms of social difference. Likewise, monetary media, communications media are nothing but extensions of monetization strategies, right? Attempts to capture value from the social metabolism and to convert that social creativity, the creativity that potentially could belong to us or to all of us, to shareholders and to owners, to basically privatize, capture and privatize a collective product. And so when you think about the internet, what you had was the promise of democratization by the horizontalization of communication and the breaking down of barriers to publication. But the retention of property relations, right? Which is a fascist structure, where the masses get not the right, but the chance to represent themselves. And so we can all represent ourselves on social media. We can all communicate with one another. And even if our values are profoundly anti-capitalist, if we work for social justice, if we work for reparations, if our work is about practice of liberation, mutual care, all these really important things, which are not only seriously offered, but are not to be devalued or dismissed in any way. One of the aspects of that is that they become content for news systems, for computational media, and produce value for them, which is actually functions antithetically to what the desire is. So that's what I mean by sort of thinking about the protocols of a financial or economic logic as underpinning the protocols of our semiotic situation and needing to redesign those. This is where the talk's going to get a little weird, and I'm not going to go on for too long. We can talk about it in Q&A if we want to, but this is actually part of my interest in crypto and cryptocurrencies, which I have a long list of problems with and disclaimers about. I won't go too deeply into them, but I just want to say, make it as clear as possible. You may or may not believe me, but I do this. I have really no interest in crypto bros and the libertarian aspects of Bitcoin and many of the cryptocurrencies that are around. I'm really repelled by. However, I'm not dismissive of it because I see it as a development in the capacities for abstraction and the way in which monetary systems are platformed. And that makes a huge difference because money, whether it was platformed as gold or then later on sovereign monies by nation states, it's linked to social relations and community, plus behavior, which is protocolized by those communities. I mean, if you think about the Nixon shock and the way the dollar retains its value, it retains its value because the U.S. Can guarantee a secure space for capitalism through, or has been able to, through legal strategies, through policing, through militarization, through ownership, and everything that comes along with it. So so to own dollars is not only just to have money, right, in a completely abstract sense. It's actually denominated in the platform, so that it's an investment in the U.S. It's an investment in U.S. hegemony. It's a way of validating U.S. hegemony. And when you see the communitarian aspect of that, even in this negative light, you can start to think about what it would mean to platform currency on other communities and with different aspirations. And I can say this as clearly as I can. I hope that was relatively clear, in part because of the innovations of Bitcoin and beyond, because they were able to platform money and monetary systems, so what we think of as institutions, on computational protocols which were distributed, verifiable, and secure, and through encryption. This is a really interesting development because it changes the rules, and also who controls the game in a way. The thing that's so Bitcoin and its community of users is making a wager on a protocol. And as I said, this is primarily libertarian, and it believes in kind of individual sovereignty and wants to, what they say disintermediate the state, right? You get rid of banks who can make random decisions about central banks, which can make random decisions about issuing trillions of dollars, right? The Bitcoin issuance follows a very strict protocol, and exchange is mediated by a consensus mechanism, which some people say is a new kind of social contract. Maybe that's too detailed to go into right now. But like I said, the rules of the games change, the rules of issuance, the rules for the provisioning of liquidity, all these things are design features now. And the Bitcoin platform is its value as a result of the perception of the viability of that project. And it's important to say it that way, because if you think about the attention economy and this perceptual dimension of what Bitcoin is, sort of its the affect to the narrative of what Bitcoin is supposed to do, creates its value, right? It is an extension and kind of an elaboration of attention economy, in the same way that cinema, captures certain kind of values, certain kind of attention by creating celebrities. Now, people's attention is creating these currencies, these monetary structures, and the relationship between the form of that attention and the protocol is very, very interesting. Although, as I say, limited. And the reason I'll try to say one more thing about why I think it's so limited. In the same way as I spoke about Hayek and money as a capitalism as a computer, right, which translated everything into a single signal, the signal of the price in the price system. What you have there is you have a kind of information collapse, right? All the richness and robustness of social life, all the other possible ways of creating meaning are marginalized and reduced to noise by the power of the price signal, right? So it becomes monologic. It becomes a monologue. Bitcoin seems like it's committing a kind of heresy because it says, no, you don't have to have national currencies to do this. You can actually platform something on computation. But Bitcoin's big problem, as I understand it, is that it's another monologue, right? That there's no subtlety because it just collapses all the signals of attention, all the community dimensions that I mentioned, which give it its value, into a single narrative about Bitcoin emergence. So you might disintermediate the banks and the states to some extent, but there's nothing in that system, that language and that protocol, which can address inequality, which can allow other values beyond Bitcoin itself to persist. So Bitcoin is like a medium which can communicate quantities of Bitcoin, and that's it. And because it does it securely and in a very interesting way, it's quite powerful. But and I think this is where I'll end for now. It's kind of like photography in 1842 or cinema in 1896, 1898. It's at the very, very beginnings of what it might be. You couldn't have imagined, well, Bazin thinks you could have imagined, but it would have been difficult to imagine from photography the kinds of cinema that we have, or the emergence of VR and computation as sort of legacy technologies for these kinds of representation. And likewise, from early cinema, you couldn't have imagined sort of the robust, complex, effective techniques which developed out of that and became profoundly expressive. So if it were possible that crypto as a medium in a strong sense could become far more expressive than it is, but allow those values to persist, not just as exchange value, but as qualitative values, to allow them to persist economically, to create liquidity for people who are part of various communities, then you could have communities dedicated to, either specific projects. I mean, kind of crudely, for example, abolition or reparations, something like that, who work together to finance themselves in a sustainable way and develop that project. But, looking forward another 10 years, you could have far more complex forms of economic endeavor, which will allow for qualitative value to be registered in an economic substrate. And I think that's a huge project. It's a very difficult one to even begin to conceptualize, but it's something that bears a lot of thinking, because I feel that the sort of checkmate of postmodernism and the checkmate up until now of imagination by the sort of enclosure and foreclosure of it by capitalism has relegated us to making culture and just leaving the economic aspect up for grabs, saying, well, fuck it, we can't really do anything about the economy, so let's just make radical cultural form. But we know where that leads. Maybe it does really important things, not to minimize the kind of community creation, the sort of shift in the demographics of enfranchisement, which is an extremely important part of that. But if people are competing for slices of the capitalist pie, we're still reproducing global inequality. And I think we can do better than that. And I think we really owe it to ourselves and to the world that haunts us to do better than that.